This hearing is now back in session. We will now hear testimony from Captain Jamie Frederick, the Sector Commander of Coast Guard Sector Boston. Captain Frederick, it's good to see you again, and I appreciate you making the trip down from your command duties in Boston. At this time, our recorder, Lieutenant Steele, will administer your oath, sir.
Good morning, Captain. Could you raise your right hand? A false statement given to an agency of the United States is punishable by fine and/or imprisonment under 18 U.S.C. 1001. It may also be subject to discipline under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Knowing this, do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you're about to provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. You may be seated.
Captain, before we begin, just want to clarify, we try to minimize the use of acronyms, so if you can define those as if they're used. And if you ever need a break, just let me know and we'll take a recess. I see that you have counsel with you today. Counselor, can you identify yourself for the record, please?
Lieutenant Commander Jesse Brenton, 1st Coast Guard District.
Thank you. Captain Frederick, I'd like to start by going over your education and work experience background that would be relevant to your testimony today, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. First, I'd like to, on behalf of the entire Unified Command, offer our deepest condolences to the family and friends of the 5 people that were lost aboard Titan. I've been in the Coast Guard for 30 years. I've had a variety of both operational and staff assignments. I think for the purposes of the hearing, I'll just focus on the operational assignments that have given me my search and rescue experience. So I enlisted in the Coast Guard in 1994, and I served at 2 units as an enlisted member on an operational multi-mission cutter, and then at a small boat station where I was a boat coxswain. So basically I drove a small boat and conducted search and rescue operations at the very tactical level. After officer candidate school, I served at Coast Guard Group Key West, where I worked in the command center, and we ran the operations in the Florida Keys. I was, while the SAR system has changed a little bit, for all intents and purposes, I was a search and rescue mission coordinator there and ran search and rescue and law enforcement operations. My next operational assignment, I was the commanding officer of Coast Guard Motor Lifeboat Station, Cape Disappointment, Washington. That's at the mouth of the Columbia River. It's known for, the lifeboat school is also there, a center of excellence for heavy weather boat operations, and my unit was in charge of conducting search and rescue on the Columbia River Bar, the offshore environment there, and the Columbia River. Next, I was the chief of law enforcement at Sector Northern New England, where I oversaw law enforcement operations in Maine, New Hampshire, and then on Lake Champlain in Vermont and New York. Fleeted up to be the chief of response there, where I was then in charge of all of the operations. Essentially, it's like being an operations officer under the sector commander in that same area. I then went to work at the Coast Guard 1st District, where I was the chief of law enforcement for basically just a broader area. The 1st District encompasses from basically Sandy Hook, New Jersey to the northern border. And I ran or oversaw the policy and operations for law enforcement, but I also was a search and rescue mission coordinator, and I held active search suspension authority at D1. And that is the position I was in last June when the Titan case took place. In July of this year, I assumed responsibilities as the sector commander and captain of the port in Boston, Massachusetts.
Sir,
Yes.
just to clarify, can you define what D1 is and what that means from a Coast Guard standpoint?
Sure. So the Coast Guard is broken into districts. So on the East Coast, there are several districts up and down the East Coast. There's 5 in total. The 1st Coast Guard district is basically the Northeast. So from Sandy Hook, New Jersey, to the Canadian border. And as part of that responsibility, the 1st Coast Guard district, the command center there is also Rescue and Coordination Center Boston, and those responsibilities go to 1,300 nautical miles offshore.
Thank you, sir. Any other background before
Well,
we?
you'd asked about education, so I've been to various schools in the Coast Guard for search and rescue planning and oversight. I hold a bachelor's degree from Troy University and a master's degree from Johns Hopkins.
Thank you, sir. I'd now like to, for you to describe the area of responsibility and how the Coast Guard prepares for search and rescue offshore from the first district.
Sure. So I think maybe I want to take it to kind of an elementary level to start, and because when we talk about the timeline, I'll talk about receiving the call. So I want to explain what that means. All over the Coast Guard, we have sectors, which are work under the districts, and I don't want to make this confusing, but and then we have districts, and the district has a command center where the sectors within that district report to. So in this case, it was the 1st Coast Guard District, which I said also encompasses Rescue Coordination Center, Boston. In those command centers, we have 24/7, 365 days a year watchstanders who are professional search planners, mission coordinators, and they stand those watches. And so if I refer to a command center, in this case, the 1st District, that would be the 24/7 watchstanders that are there. Now, outside of the command center, there's a very deliberate chain of command in the search and rescue chain of command, and it consists of a search and rescue mission coordinator, which is deliberately outside of the command center to provide oversight and search planning. And then active search suspension authority, that's the role that I was serving in during the Titan case. That's an additional layer of oversight. There's 2 additional responsibilities that generally come with that position. One is you're generally the person that communicates with the next of kin and families during the case. And you are also the person, if and when a case gets to a point where you suspend the search, that would make that decision. In that role, you work directly for the SAR coordinator. In this case, the SAR coordinator was the 1st District commander, and that was Rear Admiral John Mauger.
Thank you, Captain. Now, can you go back to the events of how you were notified of the Titan initially back on June 2023? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. And before you do that, sir, can you define AOR?
Yeah,
For the,
sorry, it's an area of responsibility.
and for the rest of your testimony, we've defined search and rescue as SAR, so you can just
Thank
use
you.
SAR.
Thank you. Okay, so sure, I'm happy to talk about the timeline in general terms, and we can drill down if anywhere that you want to. So on Sunday, and I'll use so for the time, I'll just use local time in Boston, Massachusetts, so Eastern Standard Time. We received a call into the 1st District Command Center at 5:40, so 17:40, 5:40 p.m. We received a call, and it was a report of an overdue submersible at the site of the Titanic. So in simplest terms, when that call came into the command center, it was an overdue. And we consider an overdue vessel. There's different ways that you classify search and rescue cases and different scenarios that get you into different phases. In this case, we were in the distress phase. And an overdue vessel, in the simplest terms, means that you have confirmed departure from a location and confirmed non-departure. And that would put you in the distress phase. Now, in each of our command centers around the country, these professional watchstanders have checklists that they go through. They're often referred to as a QRC, which is a quick response card. And there are quick response cards for all sorts of scenarios, from the most basic to the most complex. And in this case, we were really working off 2. There's one that exists for subsurface search and rescue, and then, of course, the overdue case that I spoke of. So our watchstanders were working through those. Of course, the call was anomalous, and it was, I talked about it being simple in the terms of an overdue, but it was complex for many, many reasons. One, you're talking about a multi-dimensional search, subsurface and surface. because at the time we were working under the understanding that the emergency procedures for Titan was that the vessel would surface, and the distance offshore, the fact that there were no readily accessible response resources on the surface. But what I would say is our watchstanders are incredible professionals, and the first thing that they did is to look for air assets. And we happen to have a Coast Guard, United States Coast Guard C-130 on deck in St. John's. And ironically, that aircraft was on deck in St. John's because they were conducting an international ice patrol mission, which is something the Coast Guard does as a result of the sinking of the Titanic. We were able to speak to them, and the crew had the capacity to fly, so we immediately launched them to conduct a surface search. And then we started working through those checklists, and over the course of going into Sunday evening, there were a lot of things that were happening. We reached out to our higher headquarters at Coast Guard Atlantic area, and they were the main conduit to the United States Navy at Fleet Forces Command, their battle watch. We were talking to them. We were querying the Navy if they had any available resources. Unfortunately, they did not have any available resources that could respond in a timely manner to the area. We were obviously talking to the Canadians, who were incredible throughout this entire search. And one of the things that we found on the checklist for submersible search and rescue, and I'll tell you, in my 30 years, and I've worked thousands of search and rescue cases, this was the first time I'd ever worked a subsurface search. There's an organization under NATO called ISMERLO, and you're going to get me on the acronym here. I think it's the International Submarine Escape and Rescue Liaison Office. I think those are all the words. I may have gotten them out of order. And we reached out to them, and they have a 24/7 phone number you can call, and they start going through their procedures. And as part of their procedures, they put out a broadcast, basically a global broadcast to vessels at sea that have subsurface capability. So really what we were looking for at that time is ROV capability. And the vessel Deep Energy responded. They were a deep sea pipe laying vessel, and they agreed to start heading to that location with their ROVs. Now, they had 3,000 meter ROVs on board. From the time of initial notification, I believe that Deep Energy was on scene within 34 hours. By Monday morning, we were flying Canadian aircraft, both for the surface search, and at that point, we were flying P-3 aircraft with the capability to listen with sonar capability. And really, I guess an important point I want to make is from the initial call, from the time that we launched that Coast Guard C-130 out of St. John's, we flew nose to tail. So that really means when an aircraft was landing, another one was basically taking off all the way up until Thursday. We were also working with the Canadian Coast Guard to get Canadian Coast Guard cutters on scene because they were the closest. We knew that we had a Coast Guard cutter that was working off, a United States Coast Guard cutter that was working off of Greenland, but they were, the initial reports were they were 4 to 5 days away. And we were reaching out to as many partners as we could, including the New York Air National Guard, who flew several sorties for us as well. Over the course of Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we continued those air searches. Deep Energy arrived on scene on Tuesday morning, and they immediately commenced ROV operations. And again, they were limited at 3,000 meter ROVs. A point I want to make there. So one of the most basic principles in search and rescue is that you go to the last known position. And that's something that, of course, we were efforting, but we were limited in our capability. And When Deep Energy arrived on scene, they pushed one of their 3,000-meter ROVs beyond its operating capability in an effort to get to the last known position, and it failed. And they brought it back to the surface, and from that point forward, we did not push beyond the operating capability. And I think I'll get back to, we can talk about the ROV planning outside of that. It's kind of a separate string of effort. At the same time, we were working vigorously to put together a team of experts. And those team of experts ultimately formed the unified command. And I strongly believe that we brought in the world's best experts. We had, and I'll probably miss some groups, but we were obviously working with the U.S. Navy through Fleet Forces Command. We had ComSub, PAC and LANT, NAVC, Naval Sea Services Command, and then we also were working with Navy, so SUPSALV, which is Supervisor of Dive and Salve Operations, the United States Navy.
And Captain, I think you said ComSub?
Yeah, so Commander of Submarine Forces, both Pacific and Atlantic. We also had subject matter experts on board, so submariners from the Royal Navy. We reached out to, we're lucky to be located in Boston, Massachusetts, where we have a lot of resources. We reached out to Woods Hole, to the Oceanographic, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and they sent us subject matter experts, particularly one subject matter expert who was a retired Navy captain, sub-commodore. He was in the Unified Command. And we brought this team together, frankly, because OceanGate was operating without a plan. And we brought a team together to come up with a plan to effect a search.
Captain, I just want to clarify a point on that. When you say they were operating without a plan, do you mean a backup emergency rescue plan?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And, if you look at it, so essentially on Sunday afternoon from a standing start, we were handed, I think what many would think is, before this, almost an impossible task. And from 5:40 Eastern Standard Time on Sunday to 9 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, we had a 6,000-meter ROV on the ocean floor at the site of the Titanic. And I've talked quite a bit with some of the experts from SUPSALV, and they will say that they consider that as unprecedented, and can talk about some of the logistics it took to move those ROVs.
And Captain, just for the record, I want to clarify some of the dates. When you say Sunday, that would be June 18th, 2023.
Correct.
Tuesday, June 20th, 2023.
Yes.
And then that Thursday, approximately 4 days later, June 22nd, 2023.
Correct.
Okay. Captain, can you clarify why the U.S. Coast Guard has responsibility for international waters over the Titanic for search and rescue?
Absolutely. So that's a question we've received quite a bit, I think. And what I would say is, it was never a question within the community of experts that understand offshore search and rescue. The world's maritime is divided into regions with responsibility clearly defined in international law. And the area that the Titanic rests is clearly within RCC Boston, Rescue and Coordination Center Boston's area of responsibility. So I think an important point is those predetermined search and rescue agreements are critical. And what that means is there was never a delay within the community of professional responders. When the Canadians in Halifax received the call, they knew immediately it was within Boston's responsibility, and they reached out to us. And the other thing I would say is, we work so closely with the Canadians on a day-to-day basis. We exercise plans, while we've never exercised a plan for a submersible rescue. We certainly exercise them for search and rescue, for oil spill response, and we have close working relationships, and those paid dividends during this case.
Captain, when you talk about unified command, the concept, can you give a little background on that? And was it a physical location or virtual for the unified command?
So it was both. So under the Integrated Command System, ICS, ICS exists for large scale or even moderate scale responses, and what it gives you an opportunity to come together and use a common terminology. It sets up a battle rhythm for meetings, a battle rhythm for making decisions. In this case, we knew clearly that we didn't have all the subject matter expertise, and we needed to bring as much of that to the table as we could as quickly as possible. And we had a large number. We had more people in person than virtually. However, we leveraged technology to the full extent, from Microsoft Teams holding meetings to talking to the cutters on scene, the Canadian Coast Guard cutters, and the Polar Prince via satellite comms.
And earlier, you mentioned, I believe you said you flew Canadian air assets. And I just want to make sure, for the record, that you were directing our Canadian air assets to fly. It wasn't a Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard flight, correct?
Well, we had both, right? So there were multiple sorties throughout the course of the search. United States Coast Guard C-130s flew, along with the New York Air National Guard, and then the Canadian Air Force.
Thank you. And as the SAR coordinator, you were able to direct Canadian assets?
Absolutely.
Captain, can you talk about some of the information and challenges that you had up until the point where you were able to get a visual on the wreckage itself?
Well, I mean, the case was challenging for many reasons. The distance offshore, the fact that we didn't have Canadian or Coast Guard surface assets there for a few days. The fact that we were limited initially to 3,000 meter ROVs. We were working vigorously to bring in additional capability. I mean, that's obvious, right? Because we got to the point of having a 6,000 meter ROV on scene on Thursday. I'm happy to talk to some of how that was planned.
Before we go to that, sir, I'm curious if you had communications with Ocean Gate or the crew of the Polar Prince that were on scene at the site.
We did. We had been talking to Ocean Gate and the Polar Prince throughout the entire search. In fact, in the early days of the search, the Polar Prince actually served as the on-scene commander because we were limited, and that was the only option.
And it is standard practice in the Coast Guard to use a commercial asset if necessary to be the initial on-scene commander?
It is. I mean, it's not ideal, but in this case, it was the only option. And so to have an on-scene presence, that you have eyes on scene with communication capability. Again, they had satellite comms, so we were talking to them on a routine basis. And, ideally, we would have liked to have transferred on-scene commander to a United States Coast Guard cutter or a Canadian Coast Guard cutter, which ultimately we did, but that took some time.
Do you remember when that transfer occurred, sir?
I believe it happened on Wednesday. And that's not to say, so I believe that John Cabot may have arrived some hours before that, maybe even into Tuesday, but you have to understand that transfer takes time. Whoever is serving as on-scene commander has lines of communication established, and there are plans in place, and you want to make sure the transfer is smooth and you don't lose any of the progress that you've made. So it's a deliberate process. It takes some time, and we did it as quickly as possible.
And Captain, was it the understanding of the Unified Command that the Titan had survival systems on board that would allow the crew to remain alive submerged for a period of time?
Yes, it was. We understood that was possible. There was also, from the Polar Prince, Ocean Gate was also presenting us a scenario where the Titan could have been somewhere in the water column. So we focused our subsurface efforts with the 3,000-meter ROVs to search the water column. We were working with subsurface experts within the Unified Command who were gathering undersea currents and data that gave us additional information to focus those searches. At the same time, as early as Monday, when the P3s were flying, we were receiving information from the aircraft that they were detecting underwater noises via sonar, and we were exploring all of those pieces of data as well.
Sir, in your experience, can you explain the Coast Guard's duties and approach about possibility of survival and how you weighed that to potential suspension of the case?
Well, I would say in this case, we really never even got to the point to have the discussion of suspension. And I wouldn't even want to speculate on when that would happen, but I will talk about the amount of due diligence that we put into every single search and rescue case. Every day around this country, the United States Coast Guard oversees search and rescue. And I think maybe for the purposes of this hearing, I will present an example of a very simple overdue case. So if you were departing on a sailboat from Charleston to, say, Key West, and you filed a float plan and you told your family or a friend that you were going to leave on a certain day and arrive on a certain day, and you gave additional details to that, and then you didn't arrive when you're supposed to, and you have no, and so let's say the family or friend who's in contact with you now has no contact. So now you have lost comms, you have confirmed departure and confirmed non-arrival. So that's exactly where we were on Sunday the 18th with Titan. But now let's take it again to the more simple case of a sailboat. We would go into a distress phase in a case like that, and we would search. And I can't tell you, it would depend on a case by case, but it may be a track line search where an aircraft would fly the route. It could be, there could be many different options based on the information, the weather, and a lot of different things. But the point is, we would have assets up looking. We would also be doing investigative work, calling different marinas or places where they possibly could have gone to, and we would run every lead to ground. Now, I'll present another scenario, another piece to that scenario. If we received a report in that case with a sailboat from Charleston to Key West that someone saw a vessel that fit that description, it was a credible source, it looked very much like it, and it pulled into Isle Morada. We would run that lead to ground. We would send either a Coast Guard unit or local law enforcement to that marina, and we would investigate. And we would not stop search efforts until we got to a point where there's no longer a reasonable expectation of survival, or we found what we were looking for. So I bring that up in context of reports of sounds and other things that were happening, and the fact that we continued to search. Well, that's what we do in every search and rescue case.
Are you aware of other Coast Guard search and rescue cases that expanded beyond several days to weeks or that period of time?
Yeah, absolutely. And every case is different. If you're searching for a person in the water who is reported maybe fell off a sailboat and is in a life jacket and you're in the North Atlantic, well, obviously that period of search may be shorter because of water temperature. It's much different if you're searching for a person in the water, maybe wearing a life jacket in the Caribbean. And in this case, we had a lot of different information coming in, and with it, we were within 96 hours in this entire case.
And Captain, I believe you testified that over your 30-year career, you had not been involved in a subsurface search and rescue case. Is that
Yes,
correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Are you aware of any other Coast Guard subsurface searches in recent history or even the last 30 years?
No, I'm not personally aware of any.
Are you aware of the last subsurface search that the Coast Guard conducted?
I am not.
So is it fair to say that was the first time you'd ever used the subsurface QRC?
It certainly is for me. I would point out one thing, though. It's not uncommon for the Coast Guard to oversee operations where maybe we don't have all the subject matter expertise. I don't want to go too far, but I would say, look no further to an oil spill where we bring in subject matter experts into a unified command. It may be a science support coordinator who helps us figure out booming strategies and the recovery of oil. It's not even the first time the Coast Guard has overseen underwater operations. I think you could look to the Deepwater Horizon event, where we certainly didn't have subject matter expertise to run ROV operations in thousands of feet of water to cap a oil head, an oil well. But we brought those subject matter experts into the unified command, and under our oversight and leadership, we conducted the operation. And I think that's an important point because that's what the United States Coast Guard brought to this case. We brought a bias for action. We brought leadership, and we brought experience in bringing different agencies together in a response operation. And the Coast Guard has a unique competency, I believe, and ability to bring those partners together, both private and public, and in this case, international, which we certainly needed.
In your opinion, is that the power of the Incident Command System, ICS, to bring expertise needed into an incident?
It is, and it provides a mechanism to do that. In a search and rescue case, it may not always be the absolute perfect fit, but in this case, it gave us the avenue and the structure to bring those experts in to get the mission accomplished.
Captain, I'd like to now discuss some of the ROV choices and availabilities to the Unified Command during the incident. We've heard previous testimony that the Coast Guard did not utilize available ROVs for the search and rescue effort, and I'd like to hear if you can clarify that point, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So a couple things. I think I'd first like to frame kind of my response in saying that there's limited resources worldwide, right? What we're looking for, obviously, is a 6,000 meter ROV. So those resources are limited, and then they need to be available, and they need to be available quickly. And in any response, you may not always get the perfect resource to the scene, but you want to get the best resource there as quickly as possible. And I think it's important to understand a few things with respect to the ROV planning in this case. So the first point is that OceanGate reached out to Pelagic on Sunday, the 18th. And I believe, I don't know the exact timeline, but it was somewhere right around the time that we received initial notification. So OceanGate had already reached out to Pelagic in conjunction with notifying the Coast Guard. Now, what I would tell you, Pelagic at that point started making preparations, getting their team together. They had their ROV that ultimately made it to the scene, the 6,000 meter Odysseus ROV, was a flyaway kit, meaning it was packaged and ready to go, but not, it's my understanding, and I'm not an expert, but my understanding is there was some workup time and some preparations that still needed to be made. And normally, all of this would take weeks, if not longer. So Pelagic started making those arrangements. Now, what Pelagic didn't have, they had the flyaway kit, they had the 6,000 meter ROV, they had the expertise, and they knew they could get there. But they didn't have the ability to move all that equipment. And what we offered from the Unified Command is the ability to talk to United States Transportation Command and move that heavy equipment. So, and I think I heard an earlier witness say that we didn't use an ROV from New York. So the Pelagic ROV did come from Western New York. And we flew that ROV with the help of U.S. Transcom, so Transportation Command. And it took 3 C-17 heavy lift aircraft. And I think it was in the neighborhood of, in total, 70,000 pounds of equipment. That's an immense amount of equipment to move. Now, to just talk about those logistical challenges, that equipment had to be moved to St. John's, and then it had to be trucked from the airport to the seaport, and then it had to be loaded onto a vessel of opportunity, which was the Horizon Arctic. Now, again, normally would take weeks to do this, and I think there's an important point to be made here as well. It's not as simple as when that equipment shows up at the seaport, you don't just pick it up and put it on the vessel of opportunity, but it has to be welds. There has to be brackets that are fabricated, and it has to be welded to the deck. And it was an incredible team effort with the team from Pelagic and all the folks on the ground that went through that, and they were able to load all that equipment on board and get the Horizon Arctic underway, I believe, on early in the morning on Tuesday. Is that correct? What is the timeline? No, it was Wednesday. So Wednesday the 21st at, I think, 5:30. So 5:30 in the morning, local time in St. John's, they were underway. And of course, they were on scene by Thursday. And they arrived in the early hours, and by 9 o'clock local, they were on the ocean floor, and we had discovered the debris field. While all of this is going on, we were working with the subsurface team of experts in the Unified Command, and they were the folks from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, who have done extensive mapping of the ocean floor of the site of Titanic. They were providing the team information on where they believed the Titan would be, and their information was accurate. When we were able to get the 6,000 meter ROV on scene, they quickly found the debris field. An additional thing I wanted to bring up on the ROV. So on top of, in addition to working to get the Pelagic team out there, we're talking about that level of heavy lift. I mean, that's an immense amount of effort to get that equipment on scene. At the same time, we had a backup plan. And the backup plan was there was a French vessel with a 6,000 meter ROV, and they were en route. What they didn't have was their ROV, the team of operators. And we were working behind the scenes as quickly as we could to get that team of French operators there, and that was a pretty immense effort in itself. And the Canadians were incredible in that effort. The French team flew into St. John's. They were escorted by RCMP, a police escort to the port. They loaded onto a Canadian Coast Guard cutter, and they were headed out to scene. And they arrived on scene on Thursday, but of course by that time, the Odysseus was already in the water.
Captain, I think you mentioned it earlier, but were there any communications issues between the Canadian Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, or any other like military type, not military assets, but government assets?
No, not beyond the normal, maybe normal challenges you would, in any response. Communications can be a challenge, but I would say nothing that impacted our ability to get the mission done. In fact, I would actually argue the opposite, that the communication between the U.S. Navy and the United States Coast Guard was incredible. Our Coast Guard Atlantic Area Command, Atlantic Area Commander at the time, Vice Admiral Lunday, was having communications directly with the Navy, and we were receiving all of the assets that we needed.
During your time in the 1st District, did you ever have any exercises or search and rescue exercises with the Canadians prior to this event, sir?
We do. We exercise with the Canadians on an annual basis.
Did that always occur every year?
It does. Whether it be a tabletop exercise where you're just exercising the plans and the lines of communication, or exercises where you're actually putting assets out on the water.
During the response to the Titan, were there any weather factors that influenced the search?
There were several days where the ceiling was low. I think the aircraft were limited to 5 there were 500-foot ceiling at certain points. I mean, in general terms, the search conditions were good. That's relative, right? You're 1,000 miles off the coast of, or 900 miles from Cape Cod, 400 miles south of St. John's. It gets rough, but we weren't hampered severely by weather.
Thank you, Captain. At this time, I'd like to pass the questioning to Lieutenant Commander Emmons.
Good afternoon, Captain Frederick. Can you explain who's in charge of search and rescue operations for the Coast Guard in the distress phase?
Well, I mean, the SAR coordinator is always ultimately in charge, but the search and rescue mission coordinator is the one who is overseeing the operations.
In general, you had mentioned your search and rescue training, but can you kind of describe the training that command center staffs receive to execute search missions?
Sure. There are formalized schools at our training center in Yorktown. There's also on-the-job training. There's extensive qualifications and tasks that you have to do, and it takes, ultimately, to be a search and rescue mission coordinator, it takes years.
And is underwater search and rescue taught in SAR school?
No, I don't think there's any detailed level of course material there. Now, understand this is these events don't happen with a high level of frequency. So again, though, you can apply the basic principles of search and rescue really to any response, and that's what we did in this case.
Was there any impact to Titan search operations due to personnel shortages, or either on ashore or the ships or aircrafts that would normally have been utilized for the search mission?
No, not to our resources. What I would say, though, is that anytime you deal with a response of this nature, a large-scale response, your local resources are, you're overwhelmed in the beginning. But what you do, and what we did, is you bring additional resources in, and we did that. We brought in the Coast Guard incident management team, some additional public affairs support, and we started to build a team of support around the existing command structure. And another thing that we did is we separated the Titan search from the watch floor, so from normal First District operations, because as this is going on, there are operations that are going on all over the Northeast, so the First District's the Northeast, on any given day. I mean, look at a day, just yesterday, we had search and rescue cases going on in the Northeast. We had our sector in New York was overseeing maritime security operations for the United Nations General Assembly. I mean, these things are going on a daily basis, and when you have a large-scale event, you need to separate that and keep everyday operations going on.
Was all the equipment that would be used in the search and rescue operations in a full state of readiness, such as computer systems, software, radio, communications, vessel assets?
Yes.
What are the Coast Guard procedures, what Coast Guard procedures will cover the planning and execution of subsea search and rescue operations?
Well, there's like I said, there's a checklist for that you go through, and in many respects, the initial actions are the same, right? We talked about, we put assets on scene because, again, we had to operate under the assumption that there's a possibility that the Titan was on the surface. So that planning, we're calculating the set and the drift through computer models that we have, and coming up with search patterns to continue to search the surface. At the same time, we were conducting subsurface searches with really being driven by the data that we were receiving from the experts in the Unified Command.
How do those QRC code, the quick response cards, how are they developed?
So they are living documents. I think is probably the most important piece of that, right? We, as technology changes, as the environment changes, those are updated. There's always, so they exist, but there's always an opportunity to change those, and so they're developed using our experience and expertise. But again, they continue to grow and develop as things change.
And yeah, I know you kind of went into this a little bit, but at the time of the incident, did the Coast Guard maintain a list of resources that might be contacted to assist in underwater search activities, or did that come from the company who maintains like a list of available resources?
Well, we didn't have a list of necessarily available ROV resources, but what we did have is, I mean, the one of the first places we reached out to was to the United States Navy, and then we started to work from there.
You had mentioned that OceanGate didn't have a rescue plan. Can you kind of go into that? How did you know they didn't have a plan?
Well, if they did, it was never presented to us in the Unified Command.
When did you become aware of reports of noises being detected on sonar buoys in the vicinity of the search location? Can you kind of expand on the details of if you received reports of noises?
Sure. Really, as soon as the P3 started flying, so Monday the 19th, and we immediately were, so a couple things we did there. We were investigating the noises, both with the polar prints and their sonar capability, obviously with additional P3 flights, and then we were gathering all of that data over the course of really the next 24 hours or so, and we packaged that data and we gave it to the United States Navy, and they analyzed it. And I believe by, I don't know, I can't remember the exact date, either Tuesday, the 20th, or Wednesday, we received a definitive answer from the United States Navy that, two pieces of information that they told us. One was that the sounds were not coming in regular intervals, as was being reported. There was a lot of reports of 30-minute intervals. The Navy looked at that data and said that that wasn't the case, and two, they were 100% certain that it was not human in nature or knocking on a hull of a vessel. And as soon as we received that information, I personally shared that with the family before we released it in the media, with the families, I'm sorry.
How did receiving that report affect your search and rescue decisions?
Well, it's one piece of data, right? There were about 1,000 pieces of data coming into us. We were also very, very close to having the 6,000-meter ROVs on scene at that point, and we knew exactly what we needed to do, and that was to get the pelagic ROV on scene early Thursday morning and get to the last known position. So we continued to work as vigorously as we could to reach that goal.
Were you ever told by crew members or employees of OceanGate on board the Polar Prince that they felt or heard something around the time they lost communications with the Titan?
No, that was never passed to the Unified Command.
Did you only direct the surface search and rescue assets, or did you also direct the underwater search and rescue assets, such as the ROVs?
The Unified Command was directing both. We were providing that information to the on-scene assets on where to focus those underwater searches. Again, being limited at the 3,000 meter, we were doing everything we could, working with the Polar Prince and OceanGate under that theory that there was a possibility that they could be somewhere in the water column, which, as you can imagine, that's an incredibly difficult search area.
And you kind of mentioned it, you start with the last known position. Is that kind of what you did to direct those with the decisions you made with the Unified Command to put the ROV down there? You just kind of started with the last position? Do you just kind of send it straight down, search patterns? How does that work?
Well, yes. However, we were working with the team really from Woods Hole and the other subsurface experts to take in some additional data, and they gave us a location which was accurate.
When exactly did the Unified Command stand up, and who made the decision to stand up the Unified Command?
Yeah, so Rear Admiral Mauger, the SAR coordinator, made that decision, and it was on Monday the 19th.
And you had talked a lot about subject matter experts in the Unified Command. Who else was part of the Unified Command?
I think I gave a full list there. mean, we, from the United States Navy to the Canadian Air Force, the Canadian Coast Guard, the team from Woods Hole, I'm happy to provide a detailed list to the board. I think I named just about everybody that was, but I'm happy to provide that for the record.
Was Ocean Gate part of the Unified Command?
They were. I mean, the Polar Prince, I think, yes, Ocean Gate was part of the Unified Command.
And did they have a representative, either virtually or present in the Unified Command?
They did, not present. The representative was aboard the Polar Prince.
Do you know who that representative was?
It was Kyle Bingham.
Was the U.S. Coast Guard aware that submersible operations with passengers on board were taking place near the Titanic wreck site on June 18, 2023?
So I will not speak for the first Coast Guard district was not aware.
Okay, thank you. Is there Coast Guard guidance regarding notification of submersible operations within a Coast Guard search and rescue area of responsibility?
I don't know.
In your professional opinion, do you think advance notifications of such activities to the Coast Guard would aid in search and rescue operations?
I don't know necessarily if it would aid in search and rescue operations. I think you want to have a general sense of what's happening in your area of responsibility. In my current role as the sector commander and captain of the port, if these operations were going on somewhere in my captain of the port zone, I would want to be aware of that.
And when did you learn that you were no longer in the search and rescue mode or the distress phase and the Titan was a complete loss and all lives on board were lost?
It was on Thursday morning when the Odysseus arrived on scene. The first piece of they discovered the tail cone first, and then as we continued to find additional debris, it became apparent that it had been a total loss.
And who made the next of kin notifications?
I did.
Did you feel that you were provided all available information from Ocean Gate during the search?
Well, I mean, hindsight's 20/20. We certainly, there is so much information that's been discussed over the past 2 weeks. I think it's a valuable point to say we didn't have a fraction of that in any search and rescue case. Maybe they start off like that, right? There's a saying that we use that the initial reports are always wrong and they're late. And in the fog of that response, things change. So we certainly didn't have the level of information that's been brought forth.
Thank you, Captain. That's all I have, Mr. Neubauer.
Thank you. I want to make just a statement to the record that the MBI has not received any evidence to date indicating that there may have been disturbance around the Polar Prince around the time of the implosion. Captain Frederick, we've been going for over an hour. I'd like to take a recess at this time, and we will reconvene at 11:45. The hearing is now back in session. Captain Frederick, before we continue with the line of questioning, I need to make a second clarification to the record, and I'd like to use Exhibit 64, please. Exhibit 64 is our answers that the master of the Polar Prince provided to the MBI based on questions that we asked to him. And I'm going to read from question 26, which reads from the Coast Guard MBI. Did you or your crew members hear or see anything after communications were lost with the Titan that could have indicated that the submersible imploded? The answer from the master was, with the benefit of hindsight, I now believe I felt the polar print shudder at around the time communications were reportedly lost, but at the time, we thought nothing of it. It was slight. And Captain Frederick, I think that's important for you to hear from, and I'd like to get your perspective on if this was identified immediately, this slight disturbance by the crew, and reported to the Coast Guard, would that have changed the search and rescue posture at all, in your opinion?
Absolutely. That's the first I've seen that. My initial reaction is, if that was information they have, to me personally, it'd be unconscionable that they would not share that with the unified command. I don't want to speculate on how it would have changed what we did, because that's a piece of information we didn't have. But it's fair to say that it certainly would have been information that could have had a drastic impact on the search efforts.
And to clarify, though, this, from the crew's perspective, it was not immediately connected to the event. So that is why we understand it was not reported to the search and rescue effort. Captain, I'd like to, there's been a lot of discussion about the underwater noises that were reported to the Coast Guard during this time. Can you get into detail about the data that you received and how you handled that during the rescue mission?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So I think you're referring specifically to the data we received from the United States Navy, and then also, of course, we were receiving data from the aircraft that were using sonar. So on Monday the 19th, I was made aware that the United States Navy had detected an anomaly. That information at the time was classified. And as a military officer, the United States Coast Guard is a member of the intelligence community in the United States. We treated that information as you treat information at that classification level, and it wasn't for us to share with the family or with the public. It was one piece of data. It wasn't definitive. The Navy couldn't tell us that it was a 100% definitive answer that it was an implosion. At the same time, we were receiving conflicting evidence from the P3s and the sonars where they were detecting knocking noises. So I think it's important to kind of understand that in the full context, because I know it's been widely reported in the media that we had some information that somehow we were holding on to, and we continued the search when we knew what the answer was. And I would tell you, no one knew what the answer was definitively.
And Captain, I think this is an important point from your professional experience. Since there were conflicting sounds heard underwater, and if a slight disturbance on the vessel was reported to the Coast Guard initially, do you think the Coast Guard still would have conducted a search and rescue mission?
It certainly would have changed the equation. I don't know what that would have looked like, but it certainly would have changed the discussions, and ultimately that would have been the decision of the SAR coordinator.
At this time, I'd like to go to the NTSB for any questions.
Good morning, Captain. Thank you for your testimony, the detailed testimony. I appreciate that. Because of that, though, my follow-ups are going to be in some sort of random order, what's left to ask, and I apologize for that. We're aware of a Ocean Gate project execution plan that was specific to the 2023 trips to Titanic. And in there is a list of ROVs with phone numbers and a lot of other SAR assets. Was that ever shared with the district?
No, not to my knowledge.
Do you know if Pelagic was notified beforehand? Like, were they prepared for this, or was it a surprise when they got the call?
It's my understanding that the first time they were made aware was on the evening of the 18th, when OceanGate reached directly to the CEO. And at that point, he started to again, make preparations to get the team together and get the Odysseus flyaway system ready to go.
So it's your understanding that they weren't on some sort of retainer or anything ahead of time?
No, that is not my understanding.
Was it OceanGate or the Coast Guard that reached out to the French ROV?
I don't know. I think that went via, so I think that was via the Unified Command, but I don't know the answer to that.
How about the Deep Energy?
Well, the Deep Energy was contacted via Ismerlo, which I defined earlier, if you want me to say that again.
Can you explain for us what enhanced group calling is, and was that of any use to you in this case?
You're referring to being able to put out a safety net broadcast?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so we, it was of use. I mean, that's how, so Ismerlo put out a safety net broadcast soliciting that additional capability. And it's, there are other ways that we do that via, on surface searches. We'll often, if there's a search and rescue case that's happening 1,000 miles from shore, we'll put out broadcasts and look for mariners at sea that can render assistance. In this case, it was more complicated, and they were specifically looking for underwater capability in ROVs.
Can you share anything about the range, capabilities, resolution of the John Cabot sonar? Was that of any use in this case?
We used the sonar on all the vessels that were on scene. I don't know the specific range capability of the sonar on the John Cabot.
And this is where I'm going to bounce around a
I
little.
think I read I believe that I read in the in maybe the missile entry that it could reach the ocean floor, but I'm not positive, and I'm certainly not an expert.
Does the district have awareness of where the International Ice Patrol aircraft are at any one time?
We don't monitor it in real time, but it's as simple as making a phone call, and that's what we did. I mean, we called, so these C-130 aircraft are controlled by the Coast Guard Atlantic area, and it's simple as the 1st District Command Center picking up the phone, calling the 24/7 watch floor at Atlantic area, and they'll tell us where those resources are, and that's what we did.
What fixed-wing aircraft are available at Air Station Cape Cod?
So fixed-wing aircraft's at HC-144. Now, I guess it's fair to say that we looked at those aircraft, and they simply just don't have the legs to be able to get out and stay on scene that far offshore. So C-130 was the most logical air asset.
How far is it for a C-130 to get from Elizabeth City to Cape Cod?
I don't know, 1,000 miles, 1,200. I don't know. I'd have to look at a chart.
If the major ocean routes are a great circle from around Cape Cod to Europe, why would the C-130s be stationed in E-City and not closer to those shipping lanes?
Yeah, I can't answer that. I'm not qualified to answer that question. I'm not my role here was in the search and rescue case, not the permanent placement of Coast Guard assets.
Does the District Command Center monitor activity at the Titanic wreck site, or do they have awareness of what's going on there?
Do we monitor what at the Titanic wreck?
What's going on? If some people are diving there?
No,
How about the Andrea Doria? There's been several fatalities there.
not to my knowledge.
We talked about SAR exercises a little bit. Have there been any search and rescue exercises involving commercial space companies? I'm thinking about a shuttle Challenger incident where you have to mobilize a lot of ROVs in a hurry. Have you participated in any of those exercises?
To my knowledge, those exercises have happened. I have not participated in any of them, but that's an important point, right? Because I think this case points out very clearly that as the world is changing and as humans push into different spaces, whether that be the ocean floor, into the high latitudes, the Arctic, ecotourism in the Arctic, space travel, we will likely find ourselves in a position to respond where the United States Coast Guard may not have all of the organic assets, but we need to bring a team of people together, a team of experts together to respond. And in this case, it was very clear that no one agency and not even a single country had all the assets that we needed. And frankly, it took a collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. And I truly believe the United States Coast Guard is a great integrator of those capabilities.
There are well-established international procedures for search and rescue. Is that the same for the incident command system? And were there any issues bringing other countries up to speed with our system?
No, we didn't have any issues. No. In short, we didn't have any issues.
I understand you were the liaison for the with the families throughout that week. Was there a whole team, or was that on your shoulders alone?
Well, so it was primarily me. However, there was another captain, Captain Wes Hester, he was in charge of incident management at the 1st Coast Guard District. I believe maybe by the second set of next of kin notifications, he assisted me with those. And in fact, he traveled to St. John's with Admiral Mauger, I believe on Friday, and he spoke to some of the family in person. I was not present for that.
Is there any training that goes along with that position, or an ICS position task book, for example?
There's both. Sure, there's extensive ICS training for different positions, different different levels of ICS training, and there next of kin notifications. There is some training that's part of the maritime search planning course at Yorktown, Virginia. It's you can train, you can read about how you're supposed to do that all day long. Having the heavy task of having to do that multiple times in my career, it's a difficult task. It's a task that I take very, very seriously. It's something you want to get right, and you owe it to the families to get it right. And it's difficult. This case was particularly challenging because they're always difficult. It's much different if you're doing a next of kin notification in person than if you're trying to do it via Microsoft Teams and with people that are all over the globe. But we still put every bit of effort to provide the families with as much information as we possibly could in a timely manner, to set very clear expectations and to tell them what we were thinking next. And then it's incredibly important to get that information to the families before that information is out in the press. And that's a very challenging scenario in today's media environment. And we took it very seriously during this case.
Were there efforts made to get personal effects back to the families, or at least point them in the right direction?
I wasn't part of those efforts. If there were, that was outside of the scope of the SAR response.
Captain, I understand you've transferred since then, but if you would, please pass our appreciation on to your staff, and thank you for your testimony today.
Thank you, sir. I will.
Captain Frederick, there might be some confusion about the difference between a sector commanders like OCMI zone and a search and rescue zone of responsibility. Can you just briefly delineate between those two?
So my responsibility as sector commander is much smaller. So the 1st District Commander, the SAR zone for RCC Boston encompasses a much larger area. As a sector commander, my area of responsibility essentially, and again, I wasn't the sector commander or captain of the port during the Titan case. I was on the 1st District staff in the response department. So I was working on behalf of the SAR coordinator. But my area of responsibility now basically extends from the New Hampshire-Massachusetts border to Plymouth, Massachusetts. So I have the Port of Boston, Gloucester, All the Coast Guard units in Massachusetts minus Cape Cod and the islands.
And to clarify, from your experience, would the Titanic wreck site fall under OCMI or Captain of the Port Zone Authority?
No, sir.
Captain, Mr. Fawcett has questions for you, sir.
Good day, Captain.
Good afternoon, sir.
So you've mentioned 6,000 meter ROV capability, and the Titanic depth at the ocean floor was less than 4,000 meters. Are you speaking about, like, there's certain different classes of ROVs? Like there's a class that'll go to 3,000 meters and another class that'll go to 6,000 meters?
Yes. So I'm not an expert. I learned just about everything I know about ROV operations during the Titan case. But yes, we were dealing with two different, we were dealing with 3,000 meter ROVs and 6,000 meter ROVs. Obviously, the 3,000 meter ROVs couldn't get us where we needed to go, and we needed to get that 6,000 meter capability on scene.
So Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution was an advisor in the Unified Command?
They were.
So in April 2016, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution used an underwater autonomous vehicle, the Sentry, to descend to the depth of 4,600 meters to recover the SSL Faro's VDR. Was that type of resource, meaning there's a ROV, which has sometimes tethers to the surface, and then an underwater autonomous vehicle that is pre-programmed to, in essence, swim a search pattern to look for debris. Was that kind of resource available?
So specifically, from Woods Hole, no. When we looked at the pelagic ROV, and again, that planning was already taking place, right? The wheels were already starting to move, and it takes an immense amount of effort to move that amount of equipment. So all of our focus at the time was on the pelagic Odysseus RV. Now, what I will tell you, though, is that Pelagic was confident that they could rig, I believe it was a cable, to their ROV that would be able to retrieve the pressure capsule if it were intact, and they had a rescue plan. And part of that rescue plan was to retrieve the pressure capsule if it was intact, bring it to a depth where a 3,000 meter or multiple 3,000 meter ROVs could get down and grab a hold of it in a more secure manner and bring it to the surface. So essentially, it was rudimentary, almost a grappling hook plan, but they were very confident in it. They were confident enough that they made alterations to their multi-million-dollar ROV in an effort to effect a rescue if the pressure capsule was found intact. And we believed, given the immense challenges of getting that equipment on scene, the fact that we were already moving in that direction with the pelagic ROV, that was the fastest, most capable piece of equipment that we could get on scene. And again, not only had Pelagic already started moving in that direction, but they had also already worked with, in the past, the vessel of opportunity that brought them to the scene. So, you know, fabricating brackets, welding things to deck, I mean, this takes generally days, if not weeks, and they did it in hours.
So my final question is, the Coast Guard's capability for search and rescue operations on the surface has a robust software program to detect the survivability of people in the water. Does the Coast Guard have to rely on the operator of submersibles to help them understand the potential survival time of people that might be on a submersible such as the Titan?
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Captain Frederick, is it clear in statute or U.S. federal regulations that the Coast Guard has the responsibility to conduct subsurface search and rescue?
Yes.
Sir, at this time, I'd like to go to Ocean Gate Council for any questions.
Mr. Newbar, could we take a short break to?
Yes, the hearing will recess and reconvene at 12:15. Is that enough time? Okay. Okay. The hearing is now back in session. And Captain, before we close with your testimony, I want to make one additional clarification to the record because it's a really important point from the Marine Board's perspective. When we talked about the master of the polar prints answers to the Marine Board's questions, I want to clarify that those were provided to the board on 16 October 2023. So that was months after the incident, and the statement does start from the master that it was in hindsight that he recalled a slight vibration on the vessel. The master of the polar prints was not associated with Ocean Gate employees and others who were on the polar prints in June of 2023. At this time, are there any final questions for Captain Frederick from the board or Ocean Gate?
No questions, and we just wanted to say, Captain Frederick, thank you very much for the work that you and your team did last summer, and more broadly, everything that you do. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Captain Frederick, is there anything that the Marine Board has not asked you that you think would be valuable to this investigation?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Captain, I want to thank you again for taking the time out to provide this valuable information to the Marine Board. You are now released as a witness to this formal hearing. If I later determine that this board needs additional information from you, I will contact you through your counsel. If you have questions or additional information that would be valuable in the future, please contact our recorder, Lieutenant Kelly Steele. At this time, the Marine Board will recess for lunch and reconvene at 1:30.